My name is Pearl, and I'm 65 years old. As I sit here at my daughter Jessica's wedding reception, watching her prepare to give her speech, my heart pounds with an unease I can't shake. The champagne flute trembles slightly in my weathered hands as I force a smile, knowing what's coming. For 7 years, I've kept a secret that could change everything about how people see me, how my own daughter sees me. Tonight, that secret is about to explode in ways I never imagined. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Now let me tell you why a mother would hide the truth about her wealth from her own child. Let me take you back to where this all began. 28 years ago, I was married to Robert, a successful attorney who provided us with a comfortable middle-class life in suburban Denver. I was a third-grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary, and we lived in a modest 3-bedroom house with white picket fences and dreams of growing old together. Jessica was our only child, born when I was 37 after years of trying. She was my everything, my bright-eyed little girl who loved bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. But life has a way of shattering even the most carefully built foundations. When Jessica turned 12, Robert came home on a rainy Thursday evening and announced he was leaving. Not just leaving for a business trip or a weekend with the guys, but leaving us. For his 24-year-old secretary, Amanda, who wore designer suits and had never changed a diaper in her life. The divorce was swift and brutal. Robert's lawyer friends ensured I walked away with minimal alimony and basic child support that barely covered Jessica's school supplies, let alone our mortgage. Those years that followed were the hardest of my life. I took on tutoring jobs after school, worked weekends at a local bookstore, and even cleaned offices at night when Jessica was asleep at our neighbor's house. We moved from our family home to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. The sound of washing machines became our lullaby, and the smell of fabric softener our constant companion. I wore the same 3 dresses to parent-teacher conferences, rotated them for church, and prayed the holes in my shoes wouldn't show when I walked. Jessica never complained, but I saw how she looked at other kids whose parents drove new cars to pick them up from school. I saw her patch her backpack with duct tape when the zipper broke, heard her tell friends she couldn't afford the field trips. My heart broke daily, knowing I couldn't give her what Robert could have provided, what she deserved. But I was determined to raise her right, to teach her the value of hard work and perseverance, even if it meant we both had to sacrifice. The turning point came when Jessica was 18, just graduated from high school, and accepted to the University of Colorado. My Uncle Charles, my mother's older brother, whom I'd barely known, had spent his life building a real estate empire in Phoenix. He was a reclusive man who never married, never had children, and lived modestly despite his wealth. When he passed away from a sudden heart attack, his lawyer contacted me with news that changed everything. Charles had left me his entire estate, 12 rental properties, a diverse stock portfolio, and over $2 million in various accounts. The inheritance was overwhelming. Suddenly, I went from counting pennies for groceries to having more money than I'd ever dreamed of. But instead of celebrating, I made a decision that would define the next 7 years of our lives. I decided to keep it secret, not from greed or selfishness, but from love. I'd watched too many families torn apart by money, seen too many young people lose their drive when wealth came too easily. Jessica was about to start college, about to begin building her own character and work ethic. I couldn't let money rob her of that journey. I hired a financial advisor and invested wisely. I bought rental properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods, diversified my portfolio, and watched my wealth grow steadily. But outwardly, nothing changed. I kept living in our small apartment, driving my 15-year-old Honda Civic, shopping at thrift stores and clearance sales. The only difference was the quiet security of knowing we'd never be hungry or homeless again. Jessica's college years were where my secret really began to complicate things. She applied for financial aid based on my teacher's salary, qualifying for need-based grants and scholarships. When those weren't enough to cover her full tuition at UC Boulder, I anonymously established a scholarship fund through the university's foundation. The Charles Morrison Memorial Scholarship covered Jessica's remaining costs, and she believed she'd won it through merit alone. She worked part-time at the campus bookstore anyway, insisting she wanted to earn her own spending money. I watched her struggle with the same pride and determination I'd taught her during our lean years. She ate ramen noodles in her dorm room, shared textbooks with classmates, and saved every penny for spring break trips with friends. Sometimes I wanted to tell her the truth to ease her burdens, but I saw how these challenges were shaping her into a strong, independent woman. She graduated summa cum laude with a degree in marketing, landing a good job at a Denver advertising firm within months. As Jessica entered her professional life, I maintained the facade. I took early retirement from teaching, claiming my small pension was enough to live on. In reality, my investments were generating more income monthly than I'd made in a year as an educator. I spent my newfound free time volunteering at the local animal shelter and reading financial newsletters, learning more about wealth management, while everyone assumed I was just another struggling retiree. The loneliness of keeping such a massive secret was sometimes unbearable. I wanted to share my good fortune to help other struggling families the way I wished someone had helped us. But I'd committed to this path, believing it was best for Jessica's character development. I told myself that someday, when she was mature enough to handle wealth responsibly, I'd reveal everything, and we'd decide together how to use our blessings to help others. 3 years ago, Jessica met Marcus Thompson at a company retreat in Aspen. He was everything Robert had been, and more handsome, successful from a wealthy family that owned several car dealerships across Colorado. Their courtship was like something from a romantic movie with weekend getaways, to veiled dinners at exclusive restaurants, and designer gifts that made Jessica's eyes sparkle in ways I hadn't seen since childhood. When Jessica brought Marcus home for the first time, I could see his family's money in every detail: his Rolex watch, his perfectly tailored clothes, the way he casually mentioned skiing in Switzerland or sailing in the Caribbean. More importantly, I could see how Jessica glowed around him, but also how she grew increasingly self-conscious about our modest apartment and my simple lifestyle. She started making excuses for my circumstances, explaining to Marcus that I was getting by on a teacher's pension and that she was helping me out when she could. The engagement announcement came last Christmas. Marcus proposed with a 3-carat diamond ring during a surprise party at his family's mansion in Cherry Hills. I was invited, of course, but felt completely out of place among the crystal chandeliers and marble floors. Marcus's mother, Linda, was polite but distant, asking pointed questions about my situation and whether I'd need assistance attending their various wedding events. Jessica deflected these questions with embarrassed laughs, promising everyone that finances wouldn't be an issue. Planning the wedding became an exercise in navigation for Jessica. She wanted the fairy tale Marcus's family could provide, but worried constantly about my ability to contribute. When Linda suggested a destination wedding in Napa Valley that would cost each family $30,000, Jessica immediately declined, citing budget constraints. I offered privately to help, even hinting I might have some savings, but Jessica refused adamantly. "Mom, I know you're trying to help, but I won't let you go into debt for my wedding," she insisted, hugging me tightly. "We'll find a way to make it beautiful without breaking anyone's bank." The compromises they made broke my heart. Instead of the elegant ballroom Jessica had dreamed of, they chose a mid-range hotel in downtown Denver. Instead of the live band she'd wanted, they hired a DJ. Instead of the elaborate floral arrangements, Linda suggested they opted for simple centerpieces. Through it all, Jessica maintained a brave smile, but I caught her crying while looking at wedding magazines featuring the lavish celebrations she thought were beyond our reach. Marcus's family tolerated these adjustments with barely concealed frustration. I overheard Linda telling her sister that it was unfortunate Marcus had fallen for someone from limited means, though she quickly added that Jessica was sweet and would learn to appreciate finer things once she was part of their family. These comments stung not because of the insult to me, but because of how they affected Jessica's confidence and joy during what should have been the happiest time of her life. As the wedding approached, I found myself preparing more than just a mother of the bride speech. I'd been quietly working with my financial advisor to create a substantial trust fund for Jessica and Marcus, planning to present it as a wedding gift that would secure their future. I'd also written a letter explaining my 7-year deception, hoping she'd understand that everything I'd done came from love, not lack of trust in her character. The morning of Jessica's wedding dawned crisp and clear, with autumn leaves creating a golden carpet outside the hotel. I arrived early, hoping to help with last-minute preparations, but found myself gently redirected by the wedding coordinator Jessica had hired. "Mrs. Thompson, Linda has everything under control," the coordinator explained with professional kindness. "Perhaps you could just relax and enjoy your coffee while we handle the details." I watched from a corner table as Linda orchestrated the morning with military precision, directing vendors, approving flower arrangements, and making last-minute seating changes. Jessica moved through it all like a beautiful, nervous butterfly, accepting compliments on her dress while stealing anxious glances at the growing guest list. When she saw me, she rushed over with a strained smile. "Mom, you look lovely," she said, though I caught her eyes quickly scanning my department store dress and costume jewelry. I'd deliberately chosen modest attire, maintaining the image of a woman shopping within strict financial limits. "I've seated you at table 7 with some of Dad's cousins and a few family friends. You'll have a nice view of everything." Table 7. I quickly realized was strategically placed in the back corner of the reception hall, far from the head table where Jessica and Marcus would sit with their wedding party and immediate family. The other guests at my table were clearly the B-list distant relatives, old family friends Robert's family felt obligated to invite, and a few elderly neighbors who'd known Jessica as a child. They were lovely people, but the message was clear: I was being hidden away, minimized, kept at a safe distance from the important guests who might ask uncomfortable questions about the bride's mother. As guests began arriving for the ceremony, I watched Linda graciously greet a parade of well-dressed couples, introducing them to our son's beautiful bride, while somehow managing never to mention Jessica's family. When people asked about the bride's parents, Linda would gesture vaguely toward where Robert stood, chatting with his new wife, 26-year-old Brittany, who looked stunning in a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The ceremony itself was beautiful, despite the underlying tensions. Jessica was radiant walking down the aisle, and Marcus looked genuinely happy as he watched her approach. I cried during their vows, remembering the little girl who used to practice wedding ceremonies with her dolls, always insisting the bride's mother got the biggest hug after the I do's. But when the ceremony ended and photos began, I found myself increasingly marginalized. The photographer took countless shots of Marcus's extended family, spent 20 minutes on various combinations with Robert and Brittany, but seemed to forget I existed until Jessica specifically requested just one with my mom. During cocktail hour, I mingled as best I could, but felt like an outsider looking in. Marcus's relatives were friendly enough, but their questions always carried an undertone of pity. "So, you're Jessica's mother. How nice that you could be here. It must be such a relief to see her settled with such a wonderful family." The implication was always the same. Poor Jessica finally rescued from her unfortunate circumstances by marrying up into respectability. Dinner began with the typical wedding reception, energy-clinking glasses, heartfelt toasts from the best man and maid of honor, and the general buzz of celebration. I sat quietly at table 7, making polite conversation with my table mates, while keeping one eye on the head table where Jessica laughed at Marcus's jokes and accepted congratulations from their friends. Robert's toast came first, and it was masterfully crafted to position himself as the proud father without acknowledging the years he'd been absent. He spoke about Jessica's determination and success, her remarkable ability to overcome challenges, and how thrilled he was to welcome Marcus into the family. The applause was enthusiastic, and I noticed several guests turning to look at me with expressions that seemed to say, "Poor woman probably feels terrible being upstaged by the real parent." Linda followed with a toast about gaining a daughter and welcoming Jessica into their close-knit family. She spoke about the joy of watching young love bloom and the excitement of future grandchildren who would be surrounded by love and opportunity. Again, the focus was entirely on Marcus's family's ability to provide for Jessica's future with no acknowledgement of the woman who'd actually raised her. As the evening progressed, the conversations around me grew more pointed. I overheard fragments from nearby tables' discussions about Jessica's difficult background and how fortunate she was to marry into the Thompson family. One woman actually said, "I just think it's so inspiring when people can rise above their circumstances. That poor mother must be so relieved her daughter won't have to struggle anymore." The most painful moment came when I overheard Jessica herself talking to a group of Marcus's college friends. "I know Mom's having a hard time financially," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the quieter reception hall. "She's been so proud, always refusing help, but I can see how difficult things have been since Dad left. At least now I can start taking care of her the way she took care of me." My heart broke hearing those words. Not because they were unkind, they came from a place of love, but because they revealed how completely I'd succeeded in my deception. Jessica genuinely believed her mother was struggling, barely getting by, probably worried about retirement and old-age poverty. She saw herself as my future caretaker, my salvation from a life of economic hardship. The weight of my 7-year lie suddenly felt crushing. As the evening wore on and the toasts continued, I noticed Jessica checking her notes and exchanging glances with Marcus. The moment I'd been dreading was approaching her speech as the bride. In traditional receptions, this would be a time of joy and gratitude, but I could see something else in her expression. There was a determination there, a set to her jaw, that reminded me of her childhood, when she'd made up her mind about something difficult. Jessica stood up, and the reception hall gradually quieted to an expectant hush. She looked absolutely radiant in her wedding dress, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, despite the emotional toll of the long day. Marcus reached up to squeeze her hand encouragingly before she began to speak, and I felt my stomach clench with a premonition I couldn't shake. "Good evening, everyone." Jessica began, her voice strong and clear. "I wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for being here to celebrate this incredible day with Marcus and me. Your presence means the world to us, and we're so grateful to have you witness the beginning of our new life together." The opening was traditional enough, and I began to relax slightly. Perhaps my fears had been unfounded. Perhaps she would simply give a gracious thank you speech and move on to cutting the cake. "I also want to thank our families," she continued, "especially Marcus's parents, Linda and David, who have welcomed me with open arms and shown me what it means to be part of a family that supports each other unconditionally." The applause was warm, and Linda dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, clearly moved by the recognition. "I want to talk about my dad, Robert, who taught me the importance of education and ambition. Even though our family went through some difficult times, he always encouraged me to reach for my dreams. and never settle for less than I deserve." More applause, and Robert stood slightly to acknowledge the recognition, Brittany beaming beside him. Then Jessica's tone shifted, becoming more serious, more deliberate. "But most importantly, I want to talk about my mother, Pearl." She turned to look directly at me, and I felt every eye in the room follow her gaze. "Mom, you've been through so much, and I want everyone here to understand the kind of woman who raised me." My heart began to pound as I realized this wasn't going to be the simple, grateful acknowledgement I'd hoped for. "My mother has struggled financially for most of my life." Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger. "After my parents' divorce, she worked multiple jobs just to keep us afloat. She's what you might call broke, and she's never been able to give me the things that other kids had. No fancy vacations, no designer clothes, no college fund waiting when I graduated high school." I felt the blood drain from my face as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several guests turned to stare at me with expressions of pity mixed with uncomfortable embarrassment. This was not the direction I'd expected her speech to take. "I learned early on not to ask for things we couldn't afford," Jessica went on, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension in the room. "I learned to patch my clothes instead of buying new ones, to work part-time jobs to pay for my own expenses, to apply for scholarships, because Mom simply couldn't help with college costs." Linda's expression had changed from emotional to mortified, clearly uncomfortable with Jessica airing what she considered private family business in front of their social circle. But Jessica wasn't finished. "I used to be embarrassed about our situation," she admitted, her voice carrying across the silent room. "I used to wish Mom could afford the things my friends' parents could buy them. I even felt ashamed sometimes bringing friends home to our tiny apartment above the laundromat." The silence in the room was deafening now. Marcus looked stricken, clearly not expecting his bride to take this deeply personal turn. Robert shifted uncomfortably, and Brittany studied her manicure with intense focus. "But you know what I realize now." Jessica's voice rose with what sounded like triumph. "I'm grateful for having a broke mother, because it taught me the value of hard work, the importance of independence, and what it really means to earn what you have. Unlike some people who had everything handed to them, I know what real struggle looks like." The words hit me like physical blows, not just the casual cruelty of repeatedly calling me broke in front of 200 guests, but the underlying message that my supposed poverty had been a gift to her character development. She was essentially thanking me for being poor, for failing to provide for her, for the struggles she'd endured because of my apparent inadequacy. "So, while I'm excited to start this new chapter with Marcus and his wonderful family," Jessica concluded, raising her glass, "I'm also proud to be the daughter of a woman who taught me that you don't need money to have values, even if being broke means you can't always be there for your children the way you'd like to be." The applause that followed was scattered and uncertain. Most guests seemed unsure whether they'd witnessed something touching or deeply inappropriate. I sat frozen in my chair, feeling as though Jessica had stripped me naked in front of everyone I'd ever known. The 7 years of sacrifice, of working multiple jobs to support her, of quietly ensuring she had every opportunity she needed, all reduced to a story about learning life lessons from her broke mother's failures. That's when I stood up. Every person in that reception hall turned to stare at the broke mother who had apparently been put firmly in her place. The silence stretched endlessly as I walked slowly toward the microphone, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor with each measured step. "Jessica," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "I think there's something your wedding guests should know about your supposedly broke mother." The transformation in that reception hall was immediate and electric. Jessica's confident smile faltered as she saw something in my expression she'd never seen before. Marcus half rose from his chair instinctively, sensing that whatever was about to happen would change everything. Linda's face went pale, probably fearing some kind of embarrassing emotional breakdown from the humiliated mother. For the past 7 years, I began, my voice steady and clear, I have listened to my daughter talk about her poor, struggling mother. I have watched her make financial decisions based on the belief that I was barely scraping by. I have seen her accept limitations and sacrifices because she thought her mother was, as she so eloquently put it, broke. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, opening the banking app I checked every morning. Jessica, honey, would you like to know what your broke mother is actually worth? The silence in the room was so complete I could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. Jessica stared at me with growing confusion and what looked like the first flickers of panic. My current net worth is just over $8.7 million, I announced, holding up my phone so the nearest tables could see the account balances displayed on the screen. That includes 4 rental properties in Denver, 6 properties in Boulder, a diversified stock portfolio, municipal bonds, and liquid assets across 3 different banks. The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible. I heard someone's wine glass hit the floor and shatter, but no one moved to clean it up. Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, no sound emerging. You want to know about your college education, sweetheart? I continued, my voice growing stronger. That scholarship you were so proud of winning, the Charles Morrison Memorial Scholarship, that covered your remaining tuition after financial aid, I established that fund. I paid for your college education, every penny. Marcus sank back into his chair, staring at me with an expression of complete shock. Linda looked as though she might faint, her carefully applied makeup suddenly seeming garish against her pale skin. Those multiple jobs I worked when you were growing up. I kept going, years of suppressed truth pouring out. Yes, that part was real. I did struggle. I did work nights and weekends to support us after your father left. But 7 years ago, I inherited a substantial estate from my Uncle Charles, and I've been quietly building wealth ever since. I pulled out copies of my most recent tax returns, property, deeds, and investment statements that I'd brought with me, originally planning to present them as part of a joyful wedding gift revelation. These documents show property taxes I paid last year on buildings I own. This statement shows dividend income that's more than most people's annual salaries. This letter is from my financial advisor confirming the establishment of the scholarship fund that paid for your education. Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Mom, this is impossible. You live in that tiny apartment, you drive that old car, you shop at thrift stores. I live in that apartment because it's comfortable and I like the neighborhood, I replied. I drive that car because it runs perfectly and I don't need to impress anyone. I shop at thrift stores because I enjoy finding unique pieces and because I believe in reducing waste. None of those choices were driven by financial necessity, Jessica. They were driven by my values. The revelation was sinking in around the room like a stone dropped in still water, creating ripples of shocked whispers and stunned expressions. I noticed Robert looking particularly uncomfortable, probably remembering all the years he'd felt superior about his financial contributions, while assuming I was struggling in poverty. But why? Jessica's voice cracked with emotion. Why would you let me think you were poor? Why would you let me worry about you? Why would you let me feel ashamed? For the first time since I'd started speaking, my voice softened. Because I wanted you to develop your own character, your own work ethic, your own sense of accomplishment. I watched too many young people become entitled and lazy when money came too easily. I wanted you to know what it felt like to earn your own way, to value education and hard work, to develop empathy for people who genuinely struggle. I looked around the room at the stunned faces staring back at me. I had planned to tell you all of this privately after the honeymoon as my wedding gift to you both. I was going to present you with the trust fund I'd established for your future, explain my deception, and ask for your forgiveness for keeping this secret. My voice hardened again as I continued. But after listening to your speech tonight, after being repeatedly called broke and having my supposed failures presented as character-building exercises for you, I realized that perhaps my experiment in teaching humility had failed more dramatically than I'd imagined. The room remained silent, but I could see the wheels turning in people's minds. Marcus's college friends were probably recalculating every assumption they'd made about Jessica's background. Linda was likely processing the fact that she'd been condescending to a woman worth more than her family's entire car dealership business. So Jessica, I concluded, looking directly at my daughter, I hope you've learned something valuable about making assumptions about judging people by their appearances, and about the difference between being broke and choosing to live simply. Because right now your supposedly broke mother is going home to reconsider some important decisions about her will and the trust fund she'd prepared for you. With that, I walked calmly back to table 7, collected my purse and headed for the exit. The entire reception hall remained frozen in stunned silence as I made my way to the door, my heels clicking steadily against the floor with each step toward whatever came next. The weeks following Jessica's wedding were unlike anything I'd experienced in my adult life. My phone rang constantly, with calls from Jessica, Marcus, and even Linda, all trying to process what had happened and understand the implications of my revelation. I let most of them go to voicemail initially, needing time to sort through my own emotions about how everything had unfolded. Jessica's messages started angry and accusatory. "Mom, I can't believe you lied to me for 7 years. How could you let me struggle when you had the means to help? How could you watch me worry about your future when you were secretly wealthy?" But as the days passed, her tone began to shift toward something more introspective and eventually genuinely remorseful. The turning point came 3 weeks after the wedding when Jessica appeared at my apartment door. Not the confident bride from her wedding day, but a young woman who looked like she'd been doing some serious soul-searching. She was dressed simply, without the designer accessories I'd noticed her gravitating toward since meeting Marcus, and her eyes were red from crying. "Mom, can we talk?" she asked quietly. "Really talk, not just leave angry voicemails for each other." We sat in my living room, the same modest space where she'd grown up, and for the first time in years, we had a completely honest conversation. Jessica told me how humiliated she felt about her speech, how she'd replayed my words from the reception over and over, trying to understand where she'd gone so wrong. She talked about the pressure she'd felt from Marcus's family to distance herself from her unfortunate background and how she'd internalized their judgments about our life together. I think somewhere along the way I started seeing our life through their eyes. She admitted tears flowing freely. Instead of remembering how happy we were in that little apartment, how proud I was of your strength, how much I admired your work ethic, I began to see it all as something embarrassing, something to overcome. I listened without interrupting, letting her work through the realization that she'd allowed other people's values to override the lessons I'd tried so hard to teach her. She talked about the shame she felt for repeatedly calling me broke in front of 200 guests, for treating my supposed financial struggles as a character-building experience, rather than recognizing the dignity and strength it had taken to support her alone. "I don't even know who I became," she said finally. "The daughter who gave that speech, who was embarrassed by her mother's apartment and car and clothes, that wasn't the person you raised. That was someone trying so hard to fit into a world that I forgot where I came from and what really matters." Our conversation lasted for hours, moving through anger and hurt towards something deeper and more genuine than we'd shared in years. I explained my reasoning for keeping the inheritance secret, acknowledging that perhaps I'd been too extreme in my approach, too controlling in my desire to shape her character development. I admitted that watching her struggle with financial decisions when I could have helped had been painful for me too, but that I'd believed the lessons she'd learned would serve her well throughout life. The ironic thing, I told her as evening shadows began to fall across the room, is that you did learn those lessons. You are hardworking, independent, and capable. You earned your way through college, built a successful career, and developed exactly the kind of character I'd hoped for. But somewhere in the process of joining Marcus's family, you lost sight of those accomplishments and began to see your background as something deficient rather than something that made you strong. Marcus joined us for part of the conversation, and I was pleasantly surprised by his maturity in handling the situation. He apologized for his family's attitude toward me, acknowledging that their behavior had put pressure on Jessica to distance herself from her roots. He also admitted that learning about my actual financial situation had forced him to examine his own assumptions and prejudices about people based on their appearance or lifestyle choices. "I'm embarrassed to say that I looked down on your mother," he told Jessica honestly. "Not consciously, but I made assumptions about her intelligence, her choices, her capabilities based entirely on the fact that she lived modestly. Finding out that she's been quietly building wealth while living according to her values has been a real wake-up call about my own biases." The three of us talked about money values, family expectations, and the pressure that comes with merging two families from different economic backgrounds. It was the kind of deep, honest conversation that should have happened before the wedding, but sometimes life forces these discussions when we least expect them. Over the following months, Jessica made genuine efforts to reconnect with the values and priorities that had guided her before she'd begun trying to fit into Marcus's social circle. She started volunteering at a local literacy program, helping adults learn to read. She downsized some of the expensive purchases she'd made, trying to keep up with her new family's lifestyle. Most importantly, she began talking about our years together with pride rather than embarrassment, sharing stories about our adventures and struggles as examples of resilience rather than hardship to be overcome. As for the money, I did follow through on my threat to reconsider the trust fund, but not as punishment. Instead, I restructured it to include requirements for charitable giving and community service, ensuring that Jessica would continue to stay connected to people and causes beyond her immediate social circle. The inheritance would still provide security for her future, but it would also require her to use her blessings to help others, something I believed would keep her grounded in the values that had shaped her character. The most profound change, though, was in our relationship. The honesty forced by that terrible wedding speech had cleared the air between us in ways I hadn't even realized were necessary. Jessica stopped trying to protect me from her new lifestyle, and I stopped hiding my own capabilities and resources. We began planning together how to use my wealth in meaningful ways, discussing charitable projects and community investments that could make a real difference in people's lives. Looking back on that awful night at the reception, I realize it was necessary in ways I couldn't have predicted. Sometimes love requires us to endure painful moments of truth, to risk everything we think we know about each other, in order to find something deeper and more authentic. Jessica needed to confront the person she'd been becoming, and I needed to stop hiding behind a deception that had outlived its usefulness. The relationship between Jessica and Marcus's family has also evolved, though it took time. Linda eventually apologized for her condescending attitude, admitting that meeting me had challenged her assumptions about the relationship between financial status and personal worth. The dynamic at family gatherings is more respectful now, though I suspect I'll always be something of an enigma to people who can't quite figure out why someone with money chooses to live simply. Would I handle things differently if I could do it over? Probably. The deception went on too long, and I underestimated how deeply it would affect Jessica's self-perception and confidence. But I don't regret the core decision to let her develop her own character before revealing my financial resources. The strength, independence, and work ethic she developed during those years will serve her well throughout her life, even now that she knows security is available if she truly needs it. The greatest lesson for both of us has been about the difference between having money and being defined by money. Jessica learned that you can come from modest circumstances and still have tremendous value and dignity. I learned that hiding wealth can be just as damaging to relationships as flaunting it, and that trust and honesty are more valuable than any lesson you think you're teaching through deception. As I finish telling you this story, Jessica and I are planning a trip together, something we haven't done in years. Not an expensive luxury vacation, but a simple road trip to visit the places where we lived during her childhood, to remember the woman I was and the girl she was before money and social pressure complicated our relationship. We're looking forward to rediscovering each other without the weight of secrets or assumptions. Just a mother and daughter who learned that love sometimes requires us to risk everything we think we know about each other in order to find what's really true. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have revealed your wealth earlier? Or do you think sometimes we need to let the people we love find their own way, even when we have the power to make their path easier? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video if you found this story meaningful. Subscribe for more real-life stories about the complicated choices we make for the people we love, and share this with someone who might need to hear about the difference between having money and being defined by it. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that the most valuable things in life, love, character, and authentic relationships, can't be bought at any price.